Smoke rolled across a battlefield that had once been a training ground. Pillars of stone lay shattered like broken teeth, and the air still shimmered with the residue of a strike powerful enough to erase a city block. In the center of it all stood a boy nobody in the Kadellan family had ever bothered to name in their prayers. Yoon Jae-Ha, 17 years old, ranked dead last in a family of monsters. Above him floated the thing that had come to erase him. A seraph-tier construct summoned by the Kadellan elders themselves, 9 meters of white fire and judgment, built from a power source that had once required 40 mages working in unison to control. It had been sent to kill him quietly, before the family name could be embarrassed by what he'd become. The construct's chest cracked open with light, gathering enough force to level everything within 100 meters. Jae-Ha didn't run. He lifted one hand, and the number that had haunted him his entire life flickered into the air above his palm. A status window every noble child dreaded seeing next to their name. Then, beneath it, a second line appeared. One that had never shown itself to anyone but him. One that, 3 years ago, an entire family had failed to notice when they threw him away. The construct fired. The light never reached him. To understand how a boy with a stat everyone called broken ended up standing in front of a divine weapon and smiling, you have to go back 3 years, to the day his own father told him he wasn't worth the food he ate. The Kadellan family had produced 11 S-rank awakened in 4 generations. Fire wielders who could level fortresses. Blood mages who commanded armies from within their own veins. Prodigies whose portraits lined the ancestral hall, painted in gold leaf, their names spoken in the capital with the same reverence as kings. To be born a Kadellan was to be born already expected to be extraordinary. Then there was Jae-Ha. On the day of his awakening ceremony, the entire extended family gathered in the ancestral hall to watch the ritual stone read his soul and reveal his talent. It was tradition, performed the same way for every child born into the house for 6 generations. It was also, for the Kadellans, a formality. Nobody in living memory had produced a result lower than B rank. Servants had already begun preparing the celebration banquet before the ceremony even started, certain of what the outcome would be. The stone glowed as Jae-Ha placed his palm against it. The light that rose from the surface was pale and thin, and stayed that way far longer than anyone expected. Conversations in the hall slowly died out one by one as people noticed. When the number finally resolved above the stone, the hall went silent in a way that had nothing to do with awe. Whispers started before his father even reached the front of the hall. Someone in the back asked, quietly, if the ritual stone was broken. Nobody corrected them, because it was easier to believe the stone was wrong than to believe a Kadellan child could produce a result like that. His father did not speak to him for 6 days. When he finally did, it was in the estate's private study, without ever looking up from the documents on his desk. He informed Jae-Ha that he would still be permitted to live in the Eastern Wing, provided he understood that his name would no longer be entered into the family ledger for inheritance, and that he was expected to disappear from any gathering where guests from other houses might be present. It was said the way a man might explain a minor accounting adjustment. There was no anger in it. That somehow made it worse. His mother had died when he was young, of an illness the family's own healers had been slow to treat once it became clear the effort might be wasted on someone who wouldn't inherit anything. There was no one left in the estate to argue on Jae-Ha's behalf, no one whose voice carried enough weight to matter. His younger half-brother, Yoon Jae-Ha, had awakened 2 years prior with a fire affinity so pure that instructors from the Royal Academy had personally traveled to the estate to recruit him before he'd even finished his combat trials. Jae-Ha was everything Jae-Ha wasn't. Celebrated, adored, photographed for house propaganda holding flames in his bare hands like they were nothing more than warm water. He wasn't cruel to Jae-Ha, not exactly. He simply looked past him, the way people look past furniture that's always been in the room. Some days Jae-Ha thought that was worse than cruelty. Cruelty at least required someone to notice you existed. The estate's tutors stopped showing up to Jae-Ha's lessons within a month of the ceremony. Combat instructors refused to spar with a student who registered 0 growth, on the reasoning that training someone incapable of improvement was a waste of a session that could go to a student who mattered. The household staff were polite to him out of habit, but even they had learned, over time, to stop asking how his day had gone. He was allowed to keep his room, his meals, and nothing else. For 3 years, Jae-Ha trained alone in a courtyard nobody used, a narrow strip of packed dirt behind the old stables that the rest of the family had long since forgotten existed. He taught himself from manuals he stole out of the estate library late at night, copying stances out of books meant for soldiers, not nobles. He ran drills until his legs shook. He threw punches at a wooden post wrapped in old cloth until his knuckles split and scarred over, again and again, because it was the only thing that made the humiliation quiet down in his chest, even for an hour. He never leveled up. Not once. Every combat log he checked showed the same flat, mocking line, no matter how hard he pushed his body. There were nights he sat in that courtyard long after the estate had gone dark, staring at that number, wondering if the rest of his life was simply going to be this, invisible, discarded, and stuck at 0, while his brother's name was carved into trophies down the hall. What none of them knew, what even Jae-Ha didn't understand yet, was that the number wasn't measuring failure. It was measuring something the system had no other category for, something so rare that in 6 generations of Kadellan bloodlines, nobody had ever needed to write the classification for it. Everything changed on the day the Kadellan family sent a low-tier hunting party into the Ashfall dungeon, a site cleared dozens of times before, considered safe enough to bring along the one member of the household nobody would miss if something went wrong. It was framed publicly as an opportunity, a chance for Jae-Ha to finally prove some kind of use to the family. Privately, everyone involved understood exactly what kind of opportunity it actually was. Jae-Ha knew it too, and went anyway, because staying in that courtyard for another year sounded worse than dying somewhere that at least had a chance of being different. The first 2 floors of Ashfall passed without incident, the hunting party moving with the practiced boredom of people who had cleared this dungeon a dozen times. Jae-Ha carried supplies at the back of the group, spoken to only when someone needed something handed to them. He didn't mind. It was, in its own way, more attention than he got at home. Everything went wrong on the 3rd floor. The dungeon's guardian, a beast far above what Ashfall had ever produced before, one that should never have spawned in a site this low tier, tore through the hunting party's front line in seconds. A scorpion-tailed horror wrapped in crystalline armor, moving faster than anything its size should have been able to move, it shattered the lead mage's barrier on the first strike and sent the rest of the party scattering. Screamed orders to retreat filled the chamber. Nobody thought to check if Jae-Ha was keeping up. He wasn't. He'd frozen near the back, watching the creature's tail sweep through the space where the party's healer had been standing a half-second earlier. And by the time he tried to run, the guardian had already turned toward the only member of the group too slow and too unimportant for anyone to wait for. The surviving mages didn't hesitate to retreat further, leaving him behind in the chaos to buy them time to reach the stairs. The guardian's stinger drove through Jae-Ha's shoulder before he could get his arm up to block it. He should have died there, pinned against the chamber wall with poison already spreading black lines beneath his skin. Instead, something inside him fractured open. Pain became information. As the venom burned through his veins, he realized, in a moment of clarity that cut through the agony, that the guardian's poison, its raw physical force, even the ambient mana saturating its crystalline shell, were all being pulled into him. Catalogued. Stored. His growth had never been 0. He wasn't a stat growth type at all. He was an absorption type, one so rare the system had no visible category for it, and the only way to see the real number was to survive enough contact with something powerful enough to register on it. Jae-Ha didn't understand any of that yet. All he understood in the haze of blood loss was that the pain in his shoulder was fading faster than it should, and that when he closed his fist around the stinger still buried in his flesh, it felt heavier than it ever had before, not weaker. He tore the stinger free with his own hand, ignoring what should have been unbearable pain, and picked up a fallen mage's discarded blade from the chamber floor. He drove it into the guardian's exposed throat joint with a strength that shouldn't have belonged to a boy the family had spent 3 years calling worthless. The beast reared, thrashed, and dropped. Jae-Ha stood over it in the sudden silence of the chamber, blood soaking through his shirt, staring at his own hands like he was meeting them for the first time. He limped out of the dungeon alone, catching up with the retreating hunting party near the entrance. When they found him alive, they assumed he'd simply hidden until the threat passed, the way anyone unimportant enough to abandon might. Nobody asked how a guardian that strong had died from a single wound. Nobody checked what was happening beneath his skin. Nobody thought to. Jae-Ha decided, standing there bleeding and unclaimed by anyone's concern, that he would keep it that way for as long as he could. The next year became a quiet experiment, conducted entirely alone, in the same forgotten courtyard where he'd spent 3 years failing to level up. Jae-Ha began seeking out danger deliberately. Low-tier monster nests near the estate's outer boundary, abandoned relic sites the family no longer bothered to guard. Anything strong enough to fight back, but not strong enough to kill him outright before he learned his own limits. He discovered the rules of his power piece by piece, the way an addict learns a drug's exact edges through repetition. Except every lesson came wrapped in real pain that he had no choice but to walk through if he wanted the next piece of the puzzle. His ability absorbed any energy used against him. Elemental damage, physical force amplified by skill, even curses laid by dying creatures with their last breath. The stronger the attack, the more it fed him. But it only activated on contact. He had to actually take the hit, fully, without flinching away, which meant every training session doubled as torture he inflicted on himself in the dark, alone, with no one to hear him if something went wrong. He also learned that absorbed power didn't just sit there dormant. It could be reshaped. A wolf-type beast's raw physical force, once absorbed, came back out of his own hands not as claws or fangs, but as blunt destructive strength he could shape however his body already knew how to move. Meaning his years of self-taught, amateur unarmed combat were no longer wasted on a body with nothing behind it. For the first time, his training and his power were speaking the same language. He kept his combat records hidden behind 3 separate privacy locks, layered the way he imagined someone protecting something they were genuinely afraid of losing. He kept his expression blank at family dinners, eyes down, voice quiet, giving them nothing to notice. When Taemin sparred in the courtyard for visiting dignitaries, launching fireballs that scorched training dummies into ash while the family applauded, Jae-Ha watched from the shadows of the eastern wing and said nothing. He filed away exactly how much force his brother's flame carried, exactly how it felt to stand near it and imagine, quietly, what would happen if he ever let himself absorb it whole. It was during this year that he found the only person who ever noticed something had changed in him, a disgraced former hunter named Baek Soon-chul, who lived in a half-collapsed cabin at the edge of the estate's eastern boundary, exiled from active duty years earlier after a mission that had gone wrong in ways he never fully explained. The estate staff avoided him. The family pretended he didn't exist, the same way they pretended Jae-Ha didn't exist, which was perhaps why the two of them found each other at all. Soon-chul caught him one night, bleeding from a self-inflicted training wound in the courtyard, and instead of walking away like everyone else always had, he crouched down, studied the wound, and asked a single question. Not what happened to him, but what his power actually did. Jae-Ha almost lied. He'd gotten good at lying by then. But something about the old hunter's flat, unimpressed stare made the lie feel pointless. So for the first time in over a year, he told someone the truth. Soon-chul didn't look surprised. He'd apparently seen something like it once before, decades earlier, in a hunter who died young precisely because nobody had taught him how to use it without getting killed learning the rules the hard way. From that night on, without ever making it official, without either of them calling it training, Soon-chul began meeting him in that courtyard after the rest of the estate had gone to sleep, teaching him how to read an opponent's full power output before contact, how to angle a hit so the absorption caught more of the force and less of the physical damage, how to survive taking a blow that would have killed him a year earlier. It was the closest thing to being taught, being looked at, being taken seriously, that Jae-Ha had experienced since his mother died. The first real test of everything he'd learned came sooner than either of them expected. A mid-tier assassin, hired by a rival house to test the Kadellan estate's defenses ahead of a political dispute nobody had bothered informing Jae-Ha about, slipped past the outer wards late one night and found him alone in the courtyard instead of a guard. The assassin was fast, well-trained, carrying twin poison blades meant to kill silently and leave no trace. He landed 3 clean hits on Jae-Ha in the opening exchange, confident strikes meant to end things quickly, before realizing something was deeply wrong. His target wasn't slowing down. He wasn't even bleeding the way he should have been after wounds like that. Jae-Ha ended the fight with a single strike to the assassin's sternum, a strength borrowed from a man who had spent 15 years training to kill people exactly like him. The assassin didn't get back up. He dragged the body to the estate's outer wall himself before dawn, left it for the morning guards to find, and told no one what happened, not even Soon-chul at first. The official report credited an unnamed ward technician for detecting the intrusion. Jae-Ha went back to being furniture the very next morning at breakfast, sitting quietly at the far end of the table while his father discussed trade routes with Taemin, as if nothing in the estate had happened at all the night before. But the power quietly building inside him kept climbing, fight after fight, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it felt like to have something that was entirely secretly his. Something the family that had discarded him had no idea existed. The real danger came not from a stranger, but from within his own house. A cousin from a lesser branch of the Kadellan family. A young man named Yoon who had spent years jealous of the attention Taemin received and desperate to distinguish himself somehow, began quietly investigating why an intruder had died in the courtyard without triggering a single alarm. He didn't believe the official story. He started watching Jae-Ha more closely than anyone had in 3 years, and eventually followed him one night into the courtyard, hiding in the shadow of the old stables. What he saw terrified him enough that he made a decision that would have gotten Jae-Ha killed if it had gone even slightly differently. He attacked without warning, using a high-tier weapon smuggled out of the family armory, aiming to eliminate what he'd convinced himself was a dangerous anomaly before anyone else discovered it and took the credit for stopping it. The attack should have worked. Yoon was mid-tier himself, trained since childhood, wielding a weapon designed to punch through defenses far stronger than anything Jae-Ha had shown publicly. The strike caught him across the ribs before he even registered the danger, powerful enough to crack bone, powerful enough that for one long, terrifying second, Jae-Ha genuinely believed this might be the fight he didn't walk away from. It wasn't. The pain sharpened into focus instead of shutting him down, and the absorption caught nearly the full force of the strike as it tore through him. Jae-Ha collapsed to one knee, blood in his mouth, and looked up at his cousin with an expression that made Yoon take an involuntary step back. He didn't kill his cousin. He could have. Instead, he simply let Yoon see, for one unguarded moment, exactly how much power had just been handed to him for free, and told him, quietly, without any of the venom Yoon probably deserved, that if anyone else in the family learned what he'd seen tonight, it wouldn't matter who told them first. Yoon never spoke of it. He also never looked Jae-Ha in the eye again. That night convinced Jae-Ha of something he'd suspected for a while, that hiding wasn't a strategy that would last forever. Eventually, someone was going to see, and he needed a way to control how and when that happened, instead of leaving it to chance encounters in a courtyard nobody was supposed to be watching. Before he could act on that thought, Soonchul decided it was time for a different kind of lesson, one that couldn't happen inside the estate walls. He led Jae-Ha, without asking permission from anyone, to a mid-tier dungeon 2 days' ride from the capital, a place called the Hollow Vault, known for producing awakened beasts strong enough to kill unprepared hunting parties twice their size. Soonchul made it clear before they even reached the entrance that he wouldn't be stepping in if things went wrong. If Jae-Ha wanted to know what he actually was, he needed to find out without a safety net. The vault's first 2 floors tested him in ways the estate never had. Packs of armored wolves that hunted in coordinated waves forced him to learn how to absorb multiple smaller strikes in quick succession without losing focus between them, a skill entirely different from taking one large hit. He came out of the first floor with cuts he hadn't been fast enough to convert into strength, a humbling reminder that his power wasn't a shield, only a debt collector that came due after the pain already happened. The 3rd floor held the vault's true guardian, a stone-skinned troll bound by an ancient containment seal, strong enough that the dungeon had been sealed off from general use for years after it killed an entire licensed hunting party the last time someone triggered its awakening. Soonchul hadn't warned him it would be there. Later, he admitted that was deliberate. The troll's first strike sent Jae-Ha through a stone pillar, cracking 3 ribs before the absorption even had a chance to activate properly, the force too sudden and too raw for his still-developing control to catch cleanly. He spent the next several minutes doing nothing but surviving, circling, letting smaller glancing blows feed him gradually the way he'd learned during the tournament's early rounds, refusing to commit to a real counterattack until he understood the size of what he was actually up against. When he finally struck back, driving a fist into the seam of the troll's stone hide where its ancient seal had begun to crack from age, the resulting collapse of raw strength into his body was unlike anything he'd absorbed before. Dense, ancient, slow to arrive but overwhelming once it did. The troll's body crumbled to rubble around the point of impact. Jae-Ha dropped to his knees afterward, not from injury, but from the sheer volume of what had just poured into him, his senses momentarily unable to process a power surge that large. Soonchul found him an hour later, still catching his breath against the rubble, and told him, in the closest thing to praise the old hunter ever offered, that most licensed hunters twice his age would have died attempting what he'd just walked out of. It was the first time since his mother passed that Jae-Ha felt like someone was proud of him rather than simply tolerating his presence. On the ride back from the vault, Jae-Ha finally asked the question he'd been avoiding for months. Why an exiled hunter with nothing to gain had spent a year of his life training a boy the rest of the kingdom had already written off. Soonchul was quiet long enough that Jae-Ha assumed he wouldn't answer at all. Eventually, watching the road ahead rather than his student, the old hunter admitted that the young awakened he'd mentioned once before, the one who died young with a power like Jae-Ha's, had been his own son. He explained, without much emotion left in his voice after so many years, that his son had discovered his absorption ability the same way Jae-Ha had. Through near death, through accident, through a system that had no name for what he was and no guidance to offer him. Unlike Jae-Ha, he'd had no one to teach him the rules before pushing his limits alone. And he'd died at 19 attempting to absorb a strike far beyond what his control could safely handle, his body giving out before the power ever had the chance to save him. Soonchul had been exiled from active hunting duty not long after, for reasons the official record listed as misconduct, but which he admitted quietly had really been his own inability to function in the field anymore after burying his only child. He told Jae-Ha he wasn't training him out of charity. He was making sure that this time, someone with a power like that didn't have to learn its limits the same way his son had. Neither of them spoke again for the rest of the ride. They returned to the capital 3 days before the Ascendant Trials registration deadline, and it was on that ride home, watching the estate's spires rise on the horizon, that Jae-Ha decided he was done waiting for the family to notice him on their terms. If they wouldn't look at him, he'd make it impossible for the entire kingdom not to. The opportunity came in the form of the Ascendant Trials, the closest thing the kingdom had to a proving ground for the next generation of Awakened. An annual open tournament where nobles and commoners alike could fight for sponsorship, rank recognition, and a permanent seat in the royal registry. Taemin had been groomed for the trials since the day he awakened. The Kadellan family had already arranged sponsors, private tutors, and a full media presence to celebrate what everyone assumed would be an easy championship run for their golden son. Jae-Ha entered under a false registry named 3 days before the deadline, using a loophole reserved for unclassified participants. A category that existed on paper but had never once been used in the tournament's history, because no one with a stat that broken had ever survived long enough to compete at this level. Nobody in the family noticed his name on the roster. Why would they check a bracket for someone they'd already erased from the ledger? His early matches were unremarkable by design. He fought just hard enough to win, absorbing exactly as much of his opponent's output as he needed and no more, keeping his real strength buried far beneath what the crowd could see. Commentators dismissed him as a lucky nobody riding weak opposition, one even joking on the broadcast that the unclassified bracket existed mostly to give the crowd a laugh between real matches. That suited him perfectly. He wanted exactly that level of attention, enough to advance, not enough to be studied. His opening match, in the round of 32, drew barely any notice at all. His opponent was a minor merchant house's second son, competent but unremarkable, wielding a wind affinity that had earned him a comfortable string of wins against equally unremarkable competition. Jae-Ha let the boys' attacks land, absorbed just enough to close the gap, and ended the match quickly enough that most of the crowd was still finding their seats when it finished. A few commentators didn't even bother replaying the finish, assuming it wasn't worth the broadcast time. He used the days between matches to keep training in secret, slipping out of the guest quarters the tournament provided to run drills in an abandoned lot near the arena, Soonchul occasionally appearing without warning to correct his footwork or point out a habit that would get him killed against someone who actually studied him. Neither of them spoke about what would happen if the family discovered where he'd gone. It was easier not to. The round of 16 brought his first real challenge, a stocky Earth Affinity fighter named Baran, who fought with brutal, grinding patience, wearing opponents down over long exchanges rather than ending things quickly. Baran had built a reputation on outlasting faster, flashier competitors, letting them exhaust themselves against his defenses before closing the gap for a decisive finish, and the pre-match commentary openly predicted he'd do the same to the unranked nobody standing across from him. Jae-Ha let the fight run longer than necessary, absorbing small amounts across a dozen exchanges instead of one large hit, testing whether his power scaled differently when fed gradually rather than all at once. It did. The steady drip built cleaner, more controllable strength than a single overwhelming absorption, a discovery he filed away for later use, even as the crowd grew restless watching what looked like a slow, uneventful grind between two unremarkable fighters. Baran, for his part, began to notice something was wrong well before the commentators did. His strikes weren't tiring his opponent the way they should have. If anything, the boy across from him seemed to be moving faster with every exchange instead of slower. By the 8th minute, Baran abandoned his usual patience and committed to a full-strength finishing blow, driving his stone-encased fist forward with everything he had, certain it would end the match the way it always had against everyone else foolish enough to let the fight run this long. Jae-Ha caught the strike on his forearm instead of dodging it, absorbed the full weight of everything Baran had been building toward for 8 minutes in a single instant, and answered with a counter that cracked his opponent's stone barrier clean through before Baran even registered that his own finishing move had failed. He won in the final minute to scattered, confused applause from a crowd that had mostly stopped paying attention, which was exactly the kind of unremarkable ending Jae-Ha had been hoping for. The quarterfinal changed everything. His opponent was a Royal Academy prodigy wielding a lightning affinity, a girl named Seola who had never lost a sanctioned match in her life, and had already been offered a position in the Royal Guard pending her graduation. She opened with a full-output strike meant to end the fight in one exchange, the kind of overwhelming force nobles use specifically to humiliate anyone foolish enough to stand against them in front of a watching crowd. Jae-Ha took the hit head-on, arms open, the way Soon Chul had drilled into him 100 times in that dark courtyard. The crowd assumed he'd been vaporized. Smoke curled off his shoulders where the lightning had scorched through his shirt, and for one long second the arena held its breath, certain the match was already over. Then the smoke cleared, and he was still standing, and the arena's damaged sensors registered a number that made the officiating mages recheck their equipment twice, certain something had malfunctioned. He didn't return the lightning. He didn't need to. He simply closed the distance at a speed no one expected from someone the records listed as having zero growth, and ended the match with a single strike that cracked the arena's reinforced barrier behind Seola's collapsed form. She didn't get up before the count finished. For the first time, the broadcast caught a glimpse of what was really happening inside him, just long enough to flash across screens throughout the capital before officials scrambled to cut the feed. It wasn't enough footage to explain anything. It was more than enough to make people start asking questions nobody in the Kadellan family wanted asked. By the time the feed cut, it was already too late. Screenshots were spreading faster than any house could contain, shared across every noble household with an interest in the trials. And somewhere in the Kadellan estate, Yoon Tae-min was staring at a leaked image of his forgotten half-brother's true output, feeling something cold settle into his stomach for the first time in his life. Not jealousy exactly, but the beginning of a fear he didn't yet have a name for. Seola watched the replay of her own defeat more times than she wanted to admit, from a hospital bed in the Royal Academy's private ward, trying to reconcile the boy who'd barely registered on any pre-tournament ranking sheet with the numbers now circulating across every noble household in the capital. She'd trained since childhood to be the best of her generation. Losing to someone ranked outside the system entirely wasn't an insult she could easily set aside, and by the second day, her wounded pride had curdled into something closer to obsession. She began quietly petitioning her family to sponsor an investigation into who this unclassified competitor actually was. She wasn't the only one. 3 separate houses opened informal inquiries within 48 hours of the broadcast, each one working independently, each one arriving at the same uncomfortable discovery once they cross-referenced the false registry name against estate residency records. The mysterious fighter wasn't an outsider at all. He belonged, on paper at least, to House Kadellan, filed away under a branch of the family ledger so obscure that most outside investigators nearly missed it entirely. By the time that information reached the Kadellan elders directly, it was no longer a secret they could manage quietly. Reporters had already begun requesting comment. A rival house's envoy had already sent a formal, if carefully worded, letter inquiring whether House Kadellan intended to properly claim and sponsor their unclassified competitor. A question that was less a courtesy and more a warning that if the family didn't act, someone else would happily step in and offer him a place instead. The semifinal never happened. The elders convened within the hour of the broadcast, canceling Jae-Ha's remaining matches under the polite fiction of a family medical emergency, sequestering him back at the estate before he could speak to a single reporter or sponsor. What had been dismissed for 3 years as a broken bloodline embarrassment was now, potentially, the most valuable unclassified asset any house had produced in a century, and that made Jae-Ha dangerous in an entirely new way. An asset like that belonged to the family, or it belonged to no one. The Kadellan elders were not the kind of people to accept the second option quietly, no matter how much blood shared his name. The council chamber that night held every ranking elder of the Kadellan house, a room that hadn't been fully assembled in over a decade, not since the last succession dispute nearly split the family in two. Jae-Ha's father sat at the head of the table, saying little, letting the elders argue around him the way he always did when a decision might later need to be blamed on someone else. One elder, an aging blood mage who had known Jae-Ha's mother personally, argued that the boy should be brought in and offered a place at the family's side properly, given resources, given training, given the recognition that had been withheld from him for 3 years out of nothing but pride. She was outvoted almost immediately. Another elder pointed out, coldly, that a power capable of absorbing a rival house's assassin and walking away unmarked was not a power you invited to the table as an equal. You either controlled it completely, or you removed it before it decided it no longer needed the family at all. A third voice, quieter, raised the possibility that this was already happening, that a boy discarded for 3 years, trained by no one, loyal to nothing but his own survival, had very little reason left to choose loyalty over freedom if given the option. That voice was the one that ultimately swayed the room, not toward mercy, but toward urgency. If he couldn't be trusted to choose the family willingly, the decision had to be made for him, quickly, before the rest of the kingdom finished deciding how valuable he actually was. The order given that night was not framed as an execution. It never was in houses like this. It was framed as a retrieval, a seraph-tier construct dispatched under the polite fiction of escorting the boy home for his own protection before a rival house could recruit him first, or before he decided to simply walk away on his own terms. Everyone in the family, including Tae-min, understood what the construct was actually there to do if Jae-Ha refused to comply. A power that dangerous, that unpredictable, wasn't going to be allowed to exist outside their control. If he wouldn't kneel, he would be erased, and the official record would call it a training accident, the same way every inconvenient death in houses like this had been called a training accident for generations. Jae-Ha was in the eastern courtyard, the same one he'd bled in 100 times teaching himself to fight, the same one where Soon-chul had spent a year quietly showing him how to survive, when the construct descended from the night sky in a column of white fire. He looked up at 9 meters of divine judgment sent by the only family he'd ever had, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel small standing beneath it. He felt hungry. This is where the story began. For the first several seconds, Jae-Ha didn't attack at all. He moved, testing the construct's tracking speed, circling wide across the courtyard while it corrected its aim again and again, each adjustment slightly slower than the last as it struggled to predict a target that refused to behave like anything it had been built to hunt. He needed to know its rhythm before he committed to standing still in front of it, because Soon-chul had drilled one lesson into him above all others in that dungeon 2 months earlier. Power meant nothing if you died learning how to use it. Satisfied, finally, that he understood the gap between each strike, Jae-Ha planted his feet in the center of the courtyard, in the exact spot where he'd once been beaten down by his cousin, and waited. The construct's chest cracked open with gathered light, enough force behind it to level everything within 100 meters, aimed squarely at a boy the Kadellan family had spent 3 years telling the world didn't matter. Jae-Ha didn't raise a shield. He didn't run. He opened both arms and let the strike hit him directly, the way he'd learned to take every hit that had built him into what he now was. The light didn't kill him. It poured into him, the way every strike had for 3 years, and for a fraction of a second the entire courtyard went white with a brightness that had nowhere left to go but through him. The construct, sensing the failure of its first strike, adjusted immediately, unleashing a second and then a third barrage in rapid succession, each one calibrated to overwhelm whatever had allowed the first to fail. Jae-Ha staggered under the weight of it, his knees buckling, blood running freely from his nose and ears from the sheer pressure of what he was pulling into himself. For a moment it looked like even his power had limits the construct could eventually push past. He forced himself back upright anyway, because falling now, after everything, wasn't a version of this story he was willing to accept. When the construct's core opened for a fourth and final strike meant to end things permanently, Jae-Ha moved first. He crossed the distance between them in a single burst of speed, drawing on every fragment of strength he'd absorbed across 3 fights, 3 years, and one final gift from the weapon sent to kill him, and drove his fist directly into the fracture line already spreading across the construct's chest. It didn't just crack. It shattered. 9 meters of divine craftsmanship came apart in a shower of white light and falling debris, its core drained and dark before the pieces even hit the ground. What remained of the construct collapsed to its knees in front of the boy it had been sent to erase, a final, almost pitiful gesture from a weapon that had never been designed to survive being turned back on itself. Jae-Ha walked forward through the settling dust, placed his palm against the construct's fracturing chest, and let the last of it drain into him in silence, standing alone in the wreckage of a courtyard that had once been the only place in his life where nobody was watching. He didn't push his power any further that night, even though he could feel how much more there was to take. He simply stood there, bleeding, exhausted, and let the family watching from the estate windows see exactly what they'd built by throwing him away for 3 years. His father appeared on the balcony first, flanked by elders who had voted for the retrieval order less than 2 hours earlier. Nobody spoke. There was nothing left to say to a boy who had just absorbed the family's strongest weapon and was still standing in the same courtyard they'd exiled him to since childhood. Jae-Ha looked up at them, and for the first time since his awakening ceremony, he let them see him smile. He told them, calmly, without raising his voice, that they no longer needed to worry about escorting him anywhere. He would be leaving on his own terms, and taking with him everything they had ever thrown at him to make him disappear. Taemin found him at the estate gate the following morning, before Jae-Ha had a chance to leave. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in the early light, looking at his older brother the way he might have looked at a stranger who'd wandered onto the estate grounds. For 2 years, Taemin had been the one everyone watched. It had never once occurred to him that the boy who'd sat silently at the far end of every dinner table might be carrying something the entire kingdom would eventually kneel for. He finally admitted, quietly, that he'd never once asked Jae-Ha how he was doing in 3 years of sharing the same house, and that he wasn't sure why he was admitting that now, except that it felt like it might be the last chance he got. Jae-Ha didn't offer him forgiveness, and he didn't offer him anger either. He simply told him that he hoped, for Taemin's sake, that he never had to learn what it felt like to be thrown away by people who were supposed to protect him. Then he walked past him, out through the gate, without looking back. Within a week, every major house in the capital had heard some version of the story. The Kadellan family's discarded son had survived a seraph-tier construct meant to erase him, and walked away carrying its power inside his own body. Recruitment offers arrived faster than the family could intercept them, delivered by messengers from houses that had never once acknowledged his existence before. Rival houses that had spent years courting Taemin suddenly found themselves far more interested in the brother nobody had bothered to name in 3 years of ledgers. Jae-Ha accepted none of them. He left the capital the following morning with nothing but the clothes on his back, a quiet nod from Soon-chul at the estate gate, and a power only he truly understood, one that had once been dismissed as failure and was now the most dangerous secret in the kingdom. Somewhere beyond the capital walls, in dungeons far more dangerous than anything the Kadellan family had ever sent him into, there were things strong enough to push that power higher still. And for the first time in his life, Jae-Ha was no longer waiting for anyone's permission to go find them. 3 days of travel brought him to the frontier town of Beresh, a rough settlement built along the edge of the kingdom's most dangerous unclaimed territory, where licensed hunters and desperate fortune-seekers gathered before disappearing into dungeons too unstable for the capital's official registries to fully catalog. Nobody in Beresh recognized his face. Nobody here had ever heard the name Kadellan spoken with anything but distant curiosity, and for the first time in his life, Jae-Ha found that he didn't mind being a stranger. He found a room above a supply shop, paid for it with coins Soon-chul had quietly pressed into his hand at the estate gate, and spent that first night staring at the town's request board, where dungeon postings were pinned in rows by difficulty and reward. One posting near the bottom, marked in faded red ink, caught his attention longer than the rest. A warning notice for a sealed site the local Hunters Guild had abandoned entirely 3 years earlier, after an expedition of 40 licensed hunters went in and only 6 came back, refusing ever afterward to say what they'd seen inside. Jae-Ha read the posting twice, felt the familiar pull low in his chest that had nothing to do with fear, and decided that was exactly where he'd start.